Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first Tech Talk of 2020. I'm Bill. I'm one of the hosts, and with me is Aaron White, our global leader for Layer 7 adoption and pre-sales.
Hi, Bill. Hi, everyone.
So if you can't hear us, yes, we are talking. You do need to connect to telephone audio by locating the audio inside of the GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar app. Dial using the information provided. Do not use the information I'm showing you now. Use the information being shown on your screen. And once connected, enter your audio PIN to identify your line. At that point, you'll be successfully connected to audio. If you need to reconnect for any reason, simply relog on. Using your control panel, there's a little orange button that points either toward your left or toward your right. You can expand and collapse your panel that way. You can view and select your audio if you need to switch back and forth between your computer or your telephone for whatever reason. That's where you would do it. And most importantly, toward the end of the session, we will have Q&A. If you do have questions along the lines, please don't hesitate to enter it, and we will get to it at the end. And everybody is muted for recording purposes. So the first thing I want to cover before we start the main session is this morning, this is hot off the press, I'd like to introduce you to the updated API Academy website. We've been working behind the scenes for months to get this massive update in place. In addition to the new look, we're adding new tutorials, primarily videos and blogs, answering the question, how do I blank? Aaron's team is instrumental in getting those going. We have a selection of guest bloggers lined up, and we're rolling out a new certification program in the coming months, so stay tuned for that. And in December, KuppingerCole released their Leadership Compass for API management and security. Their evaluation found that Layer 7 was not just a leader, but the overall leader. That's available today on the Broadcom website if you'd like to take a look at it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to today's guest, Jay Thorne, our head of Layer 7 product strategy, who's going to be talking about building API-aware service meshes with Layer 7 and Istio. Let me give you the screen, Jay. And you should be ready to go.
This is Jay Thorne. Hello and welcome everyone. I'm sure quite a few people there know who I am, but by short introduction, I've been with the Layer 7 organization for 17 years now. So I do go back a little bit in the API industry. So I want to talk a little bit about why it is and what it is that we're doing here. So without further ado, let's start. So overall, Service Mesh and API management provide a combined solution. Service discovery is pretty crucial. Service-to-service communication is also one of the big pluses. But origin to service security, something that has been Layer 7's sweet spot for the last 17 years, and observability and resiliency are a big part of what this brings to a microservice and traditional service environment. There's some challenges associated with Service Mesh and with microservices, and that is that there are multiple environments. We have customers on traditional systems dating back to 2003. We have systems that are cloud agnostic, and we have many on-prem systems. We wanted to be able to address the challenges associated with microservices and service meshes and API management in all of those things, kind of regardless of environment, rather than demanding that everything be converted to the latest and greatest. This is a solution that kind of crosses a lot of those boundaries. The big thing here is we're extending the very robust, as we've seen, industry-leading capabilities in API management to the microservices architecture. And one of the things that it does for our existing customers is future-proofs a lot of your management investment into that microservice and service mesh world. So overall, the value for our customers means that you get to plug in your existing capabilities around OAuth, preserve the existing tooling and developed assets, but also be able to use a CI/CD. And I'm going to do a very direct demonstration of that quickly shows exactly how that value is preserved. A very deployable OAuth kit, and the current implementation uses Istio. Now, we're not married to Istio. We believe that Kubernetes has won in the industry, but I don't think in the service mesh world, Istio is the only solution. Certainly Consul's been doing some things and making some noises, and there's other things coming up as well. So it's pretty important to note that this is a POC. We're going to be open sourcing it. We're going to make all of these artifacts available, but it's not the only mesh that we're going to be supporting. So one of the biggest things, of course, is our traditional role, the north-south or the Ingress role. And we wanted to preserve both the legacy and the CI/CD publishing pipelines. So that's pretty important for our customers who have existing tools that they want to start moving into these areas, and they don't want to have to do every one of the changes all at once. Broadcom's customers do, as we mentioned before, run the gamut. Overall, I wanted to be able to show support for existing capabilities, and I wanted to show that also we have new systems. The thing that is important for our customers is we're going to include config to separate the management plane, of course. And then the big thing that's a new thing for us is a mixer plugin for Istio. And that's Golang code that will be for plugin and configuration. We'll have a small bit of domain-specific configuration for the plugin communicating to our stuff, and the support pieces included so that the validation endpoint that we're providing is going to be there. We want to be able to use and extend existing auth implementation to microservices and mesh. And then this is the part that becomes exciting. This is, as we said, an open source piece. It's a building block. And a couple things that are exciting for us is we think that mesh has a bunch of powerful capabilities. It extends microservice capabilities, and we think that it's got a couple of very natural things. And one of them is GraphQL. We're working on a GraphQL project with our partner, Arvada. And this is a very exciting time for us because we think that there's a very natural match between GraphQL and its composition capabilities and the composition capabilities represented directly by mesh. So we've got the next task, of course, is a Portal plugin for Istio routing. So that means that Portal then in an Istio situation would also wire up the backend routing. And then we want to look at expanded observability. And that's a very interesting case because there are some really interesting systemic observability contained in what Istio already ships and other service meshes already ship. But we've got some pieces that go beyond HTTP and gRPC. We've got JMS and MQTT and database connectivity where we can look at transactions and see the whole transaction rate, where some of the native capabilities in those tools don't have that level of granularity. We want to work within Istio. We also want to support the open tracing standard so that that can be sent off to other tools, not just within Istio, because many of our customers have some pretty important overall pieces. So the next thing I wanted to do was talk about what is the value proposition directly, and that's making an API gateway become the gateway in an Istio system. So we're using a load balancer ingress controller, and we're routing the traffic directly to the gateways. Pretty important. This means that the point of exposure, the point of collection of your APIs is the Layer 7 gateway and its attendant capabilities around content inspection, around security inspection, and I think very powerfully also talking about all the different backend components that it can put together. So there's a couple of other things that we're going to be showing as well. One of them is the fact that we're hooking up the Grafana and Influx dashboard that we provided as samples before, just to make sure that you understand that this is all as part of the deployment. So this is an important part. It pushes metrics to the Influx container and displays that with Grafana. I'll be showing that as well. And today, I'm not going to be able to show the service-to-service communication. This is a work in progress. It's in late alpha stage, and very short time ago, this part broke. So I'd love to be able to show it, but I can't, unfortunately. However, what I can show is we're working with our partner, and this is the kind of thing that is really important, because our ability to work within a GraphQL environment and the traditional abilities of the gateway to speak to all of those different kinds of backends means that we can talk to APIs that aren't necessarily within the Istio world. Our policy-based provisioning of things like trust relationships to backend systems means that on this single gateway, even though a system is not managed under a mesh, we can still manage the relationship and the routing to it in the mesh. This is a pretty powerful capability, and one that I think makes it stand out as to why you would want to go with a layer 7 solution within a mesh networking system. And this is, of course, Istio's arch diagram, and this is just to illustrate the role of the proxy in the mixer. With that, I want to switch to a demo environment, and I have a demo environment here on my laptop based on Minikube and running locally. However, my version is actually slightly out of date, but I have a version hosted on Google that I've got Rancher connected to. Now, why would I want to connect Rancher to it? Well, this kind of demonstrates that it's a full Kubernetes environment. There's a full Istio environment here, and it's just a little bit easier to inspect these artifacts. So these are the standard tools associated: Kiali, the Istio tracing capability, Prometheus, their Ingress gateway, Citadel. All those pieces are all there, as well as what we're working on, which is, there's a MySQL server backing the OAuth, there's the Influx server and a loader job for the Influx server, and the Grafana UI. So the first thing I want to show is, what do you know? There is a proper OAuth on board this, but it was deployed entirely ephemerally. And as you can see, it's pretty functional. Everything works just fine, thanks. As you can see, all of those functions are there for configuring systems and stuff like that. So that's a fully functional OAuth tool. But as you see here in the Rancher, it's entirely deployed with all of those kinds of artifacts. These are all going to be in the source control when we get to the beta release. Come on. So as you can imagine, this is the standard things that you might expect in these kinds of pieces. So using sidecars and all of those kinds of artifacts. So these will all be in the open source version control repository we put in. We're using the standard certificate management tools available in Istio. We've got the, as we can see, the IP tables and redirects and all those other kinds of things that make this a proper Istio system. All of that stuff's there. And then I wanted to show the similar thing for the gateway. And as you can see, it also all present and accounted for. And that's also here, standard set of things, using some environment properties, some on image artifacts using the GW7 convention. But interestingly enough, one of the reasons why I'm using the Google Cloud version is this is a newer version, and this presents a meta style configuration that has an interesting thing. We're using a config map for some of the configuration right here. And what I want to do live here, because I'm just that kind of crazy person, is to add new configuration to this gateway. We're using reloader, which gives us an interesting semantic that I find very interesting. And I've got a little bundle here that happens to be a cluster property, something nice and easy to publish, that I'm just going to add a value for. As you can see, I'm completely prepared for this. Right there. This is a standard cluster property piece. Pretty simple. So just throwing in a brand new backend host name called myprop. And we're just going to pop that right in here. And this is where things get fun. This starts to make it a lot more manageable, because those jobs, whether they're done in this UI or via the command line updating a config map, what happens here is Reloader starts up a brand new container with that new configuration, and it lets it come all the way up until it's got past its availability checks. And what's going to happen is then it'll shut down the old one. So what we've got is full availability, and we're treating the containers as very much replaceable. So this is pretty useful. The other thing that's going to be interesting is when that happens, it's going to preserve the IP address. So past that that restart period, this system is just going to replace the other one, and you won't be able to tell the difference. So we're just going to wait here for a couple of seconds. The boot time in a fully containerized system is not that particularly long, so this should be going through that stuff in a moment. But while that's working, you'll see that this tool here is working just fine, thanks. So that the full availability while the back end is going and continuing to run. So it's a kind of an exciting capability, and as you can see, the dashboard here, this is the Grafana dashboard that we're using, is working, and even during that, we're getting pretty live updates in terms of the overall network. Now I'm sitting in a hotel room in Dallas at the moment. The Google Cloud system, I believe, might be somewhere in the Carolinas. I'm not quite sure. But as you can see, we're just fine, thanks. And over here in Rancher, we're going through a lifecycle event. So this is a very exciting bit for availability, exciting bit for routing capability, the updates. The way that this system is configured is to keep availability all the time while it does background stuff. And guess what? We've just switched over. So now it's got the new one and it's cleaning the other one. So that didn't take all that long to make that happen. And now it's removing the system. And in a few minutes, we're going to see that the dashboard is going to come back up again, and there it's running traffic through the new system. So that was pretty good availability for a single system. Of course, if we'd had more than one node up, we wouldn't have had any problems at all. And the other thing is, because of its Rancher, you can just bring up another one, and there's my scale. Now, obviously, auto scaling is available as well, but at the moment, I've got this set for manual scale. So we're in the process of just scaling that up, and that's going to be very exciting when it happens here. But as you see, everything's working just fine, thanks. This is using an influx time series database, and I really like that for the overall dashboarding. The overall disk space doesn't change all that much because it reduces the data fidelity. And this is also using per request logging rather than aggregated in the gateway logging. And we're using a timed off-boxing capability. So it uses the caching to prevent you from basically pounding the influx server into the ground while you're pounding the gateways into the ground. So overall, this is a pretty end-to-end solution. We're looking at fixing a few more things, making more of the things available in these config maps. There's a limitation in config maps of only 3 megabytes, and some of the customer policy bundles, the one for OTK is 11 megs, so currently that has to be loaded onto the container. We're going to be changing that config bundle so it's broken up into smaller pieces so it'll fit in the config map. The config map part is an exciting part of the overall solution, but the overall workloads that we're working on here, as I said, we're scaling up. It'll take a few seconds for that to continue. But overall, this is meant to be a pretty simple demo because really the command, it's still running through that system even though we went through a lifecycle event. And my Minikube here on my local system, as you saw, just came up while we were waiting as well. So at this point, much of the stuff that I wanted to demo happened. So getting back to the PowerPoint, I clearly showed the data plane working. There is no virtual service behind this. That's the service we were hitting for the demo there is a locally contained loopback policy. This demo would have been very powerful because that has real services behind it, and my apologies for not being able to show it today, but this is definitely late alpha, as we said. Showed this piece working, and we can't show this because this is a future piece. This is one of the most exciting parts that we've got, is having this level of availability and this level of scaling and this level of power within the system. With the traditional artifacts that you guys know, allows some pretty powerful and pretty easy to use scaling deployment. And as you saw there, I'm not sure how many people of you out there have done manual deployments of gateways, but a scale-up event that really was the click of that one button, and then having all of the pieces connected together, including, as you can see here, the scale up here increased the scale performance. And we still have this UI working just fine, thanks. So I think I've shown that this system's a pretty complete end-to-end system. A couple details I wanted to talk about. We're using some Istio-specific capabilities, actually more like Kubernetes-specific capabilities around using secrets for the certificates and for the license files. And we're also using Reloader, and that's a pretty exciting piece too. So with that, I think this demo went quite quickly, so I think I'll open it up for questions. Bill, we got anything going on?
Thank you, Jay. Yes, there is a questions tab available on the GoToWebinar screen, so please do type them in. There are a couple there already. One is, will these slides be available? The answer is yes, indirectly. Later today or tomorrow morning, we will be uploading this TechTalk to the API Academy as a tutorial, or excuse me, as a TechTalk, and you'll be able to see the slides again through that. The other question that just came in is directed to Jay, and why do I need to do all this? Why can't I just use the Istio gateway?
Well, that's actually a really good question. The same kind of question was posed to me just yesterday by a banking customer that I was meeting. And I think it really comes down to what the difference between APIs and microservices are. we find that microservices are not really publicly available interfaces. Generally, if you want to expose a microservice directly, it has to provide a business value that a customer would care about. The problem with a microservice is if it's properly a bound context, you're going to need to know the whole processing model as a customer. And if I was to provide a microservice, I'm exposing my business model to my customers. So generally, what I want to expose is a business service. I want a ship from here to there, not store the pickup address for this shipping order that I'm building. So a microservice with its bounded context is going to have necessarily a smaller thing. And if that means that the API externally is a very chatty one because you've got this microservice exposure, the overall user experience is going to be a much slower interaction because you're going to be paying the latency of that remote call every single action that the customer is doing, right? You know, multiple API calls just to provide the first page of your UI rather than being able to combine those things together. There's ideas about external interfaces providing business value where microservice is more about that bounded context. And that's not really what your customers should be interacting with. Your customers should be interacting with a business capability. If you do it any other way, then in many ways, you're kind of opening the kimono in ways that probably would not get approval if the line of business is supporting your API work understood what exactly was happening. I think that pretty much addresses the question. There's a couple of things that I did want to talk about a little bit. Some of the terminology that I use and certainly the images that I choose put the ingress on the extreme left and it puts the high security zones on the extreme right. And one of the reasons why I do that is our corporate customers, especially our enterprise class customers, generally have ideas of zones of security, high security zone, DMZ, that kind of thing. And when you draw it in a top down, like many of the Istio diagrams, it sort of makes you put all of the microservices at the same level of security. And to me, that sort of misses the point around the additional levels of security that happen as they progress further and further to the high security zones within your organization. This diagram implies that the higher security zones are further to the right. Another one is that service-to-service communication, as demonstrated in the Istio diagram, puts things at a level. And the reality in many of our customers, the service-to-service communication often straddles zones between like cloud available, internal, you know, the mainframe zone sometimes, as well as the app server zone, sometimes the data store zone. And those things all have different security implications. So this kind of diagram seems to really demonstrate that a little bit better. And one of the comments that I wanted to make is that the world of Istio has in many ways come back to the same set of problems that happened in 2003, because in 2003 we concerned ourselves a lot with load balancers and ingress routing and log forwarding and performance metrics and root cause analysis. And in 2020 we have all of those same things. We've given them slightly different names, but we have automation to make these things actually repeatable. Because I have, like many of you, sat in rooms where we found out that one load balancer or some firewall somewhere was misconfigured. So this is at least a big, big, big improvement. The automation tools, especially what we saw there around the scale up, is nothing sort of miraculous compared to some of the times where it's been midnight on a call checking load balancer configurations in 6 different places.
Okay, here's the next question. Can you talk about how this is going to benefit or affect customers trying to move apps to a PaaS environment?
Aha. A PaaS environment is a very exciting thing. So PaaS is necessarily a kind of somebody else's ingress that you're talking to. And so one of the pieces that you might want to do is when you're implementing things with a platform as a service, and so you're aggregating some of those APIs into your capabilities. The powerful thing about these backend routes here, and I'll just use the Istio example because it's, sorry, the GraphQL example because it talks about this. The customer APIs can also be PaaS APIs. And so one of the things here is the trust relationship that can be established between the APIs that you're providing for your end APIs can be literally anywhere. And one of the things that's powerful is on a per API basis, and even down to a per backend route statement, we can establish the trust relationships on a per call basis. So for instance, you can have it so that API calls for a given API specifically use one certificate and trust only a specific certificate, a form of cert pinning. And then a different API, perhaps to even the same vendor, uses a different count and therefore a different client certificate. And that's all available within the addressability, as that is a big part of the policy language. And the part that's powerful, of course, is that this works in the existing product and now works in the containerized and mesh world. So those pieces of configuration, and I'll just go back to them quickly here, within the secrets here, the certificates and things like that, those have explicit relationships into the policy file. So you can start provisioning those, holding those things in tools, using Citadel, using the Vault and tools like that, and then using that kind of trust model at a granular level within the actual API. So you're not trusting a service, you're trusting an individual call. And with the granularity available in our policy language, then you can make it at an individual specific API message level if necessary. Although most people don't, I can see cases, especially in something like a Salesforce integration, where the call to one part of the Salesforce API might use one certificate, and the call to a different Salesforce API might use a different certificate for lots of really good reasons.
Okay, here's another one for you. What's the added value of using this if we're already deploying gateways on OpenShift?
If you're already on OpenShift, the value of using this is less than some, although there's pieces that we're learning here around using the config maps and using the routing capability expressed directly in these rule sets and things like that make it pretty powerful. I would say that using Istio directly, if you're already in OpenShift and happy with that, might be less, but certainly the capabilities we're demonstrating here as an adjunct around using the fully containerized model with the bundle files, especially when they're loaded into config maps, has some real power when it comes to the deployment in multiple environments. Because as I showed, that cluster property, you would have a different version for your different environments. And so that's the kind of thing where the environment, in my Rancher UI there, I was hooked up to my environment in North Carolina, but I could have a different version of this that's specified a different URL here. Maybe that's East Coast. And that particular environment would then have a different configuration, and everything else, all of your other artifacts would be shared. It's a pretty powerful way to kind of abstract away the number of artifacts that you need to manage that are unique and start to have a real sharing of overall configuration, and then having the specifics of an environment abstracted out for you. This method allows an abstraction that's kind of inherent in some of the mesh networking. Some of those abstractions are built into config maps for these pieces. Some of them are built into how the virtual services work. Certainly OpenShift's a very capable piece, and it has capabilities around registries and stuff like that, and providing virtual services that this is a very similar consumer to. So OpenShift right now, very capable, and if you've got something working there, I'm not recommending you change it, but there's some learnings from this that you might want to consider.
Okay. Are the features available in the current gateway version? And if not, when will this be available?
This is 9.4.
Oh, there you go.
So yes, it's working with the existing version.
And along those same lines, can our developer portal be integrated in with the gateway running Istio?
That is a very important roadmap item for us. In the current version, it does not, and that particular gap is a big issue, as you can imagine. So you're not the only one who's asked for that. I've asked for that myself. So rest assured, it's something that's very much on our minds and very much in terms of roadmap. We're going to go to the beta release before we get that, and I don't want that to preclude you from using this, but I think it's pretty crucial that we get Portal working with this. Otherwise, it's not the full story.
I just had one come in saying no questions, but kudos to Jay for this demo. That's outstanding. Hopefully you understand this one. Can the auto-scaling span data center?
Well, since Kubernetes can, of course it can. Now, this one is not a multi-data center server because the servers behind this, right, are not in a multi-data center, but they could be. Okay, so the answer is yes. I didn't do that for this demo, and maybe I should have.
There's several questions relating to this one, and I know what the long-term answer is, but let me ask you anyway. Are there, or will there be, guides about using the gateway in Docker and a CI/CD pipeline, like, for example, creating services, exporting, storing them on GitHub, and deploying them to a Docker gateway?
It's funny that would be mentioned, because one of the things that we discovered while doing this project is that there wasn't much public documentation on that. So part of our deliverables here, we feel, when we get to a 1.0, is the documentation on how that stuff works is going to have to be part of this solution. Alpha will ship with some things. Alpha already has some things already changed. There's some readmes in there already that are different and expanded from what we already provide. But the final version is going to be a lot more involved, like the idea of using these config maps and how you would derive the file that goes in there is an area of active development right at this moment. So making it so that you've got reusable components that can be deployed in multiple data centers, to go back to that previous question and bring that in, is a pretty important point, because reusability of these artifacts is pretty crucial. We can't have it so that these config maps and stuff have the specificness to a data center in them, but we need to have it so that most of the artifacts are shared, for instance.
I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation that we're currently working on a new section for API Academy on how do I blank. Well, if I change those examples to how do I create services, how do I export and store them on GitHub, how do I deploy to a Docker container, those certainly sound like some videos that you may be tasked to create at some point.
It does. And one thing that I did want to mention here is this. So this is using a GitHub repository for policy. So if we go down here into this perf test, As you can see, we've got Gradle build pieces. And in here, we have config and policy, and config here contains things like those sort of things and certificates, right? The reference to the certificate used as part of that, that policy. So how to arrange this, how to set these things up, and then how to do the builds so that you've got the end artifacts that can be deployed this way is a very important part of it. That is to say, we're using a CI/CD pipeline as part of this project. Documenting how it works is one of the deliverables.
Yeah, there's, like, as I mentioned, there are several questions about documentation. Here is one more for you. This is a great question that has a good example. You talked about scaling the gateway using Kubernetes features, but what about MySQL scaling? As an example, for now, we're using OpenShift, but forced to use MariaDB, what does that say? Galera clustering. Are you guys looking at supporting that? So it's more of a two-parter.
Well, the question, there's sort of two questions there. The first one is, can you scale MySQL? And the answer is, as far as I know, the artifacts that we're providing here does not scale MySQL. So these are the artifacts that we're providing in this box. However, the other thing I will say is that backing our OAuth capability with a relational store is something that I believe is starting to become less absolutely necessary. Recent release of OTK shipped with a JOT-based authentication that doesn't need to store most of its credentials. And so the scaling required from the database is not nearly as big. So one of the things that we're looking at is not necessarily scaling MySQL, but scaling OTK. And that's an important part of the overall capabilities that we're offering from this product line. So hopefully that answers your question. I don't have a strong answer right now for scaling MySQL per se. We're not using MySQL for the gateways. We're only using MySQL for the token store for OTK.
Yeah, I think you indirectly answered this one already, but I'll ask it anyway. Can scaling also be done multi-region in order to leverage HA, high availability?
Of course, that's the whole point of having Kubernetes. Because remember, Istio sits on top of Kubernetes, and Kubernetes itself has multi-zone scaling, right? You can enroll multiple nodes into a single Kubernetes control plane. The part that becomes a little bit interesting is if you look at what I'm talking to here with Rancher, is we've got two clusters. And in that cluster, the second cluster has a very different workload, right? It's got a lot of different stuff in there. So heterogeneous, absolutely, under a relatively single control plane is very much one of the things that you can do in this space. But I think what's more important is to have the HA capabilities. And the way I understand this is that's absolutely an important deliverable as part of this whole conversation. So this one is scaled only in that environment, and given that there's environment specificity, right? If we had it so that the version control system had identical artifacts, right, then your build statements would really have just a small variant for the multiple environments, which would be the locally appropriate host names and stuff like that. For instance, those cluster properties might have some data center variation, but because so many of the artifacts are going to be shared and basically identical, some of your scalability doesn't come from having 100% exactly the same, but having most of the pieces the same and local variations supported. So for instance, a DR situation would not try to phone home to the other system's backend. It would have its own backend in DR, and so you'd want different host names for that backend.
Great. At this point, we have no further questions, so if you do have another question, feel free to type it in as we start to wrap up. I do want to say thank you to Jay for taking time out of your crazy schedule to do this, to share your thoughts and do this demo with us. Let me quickly ask my co-host, Aaron, if he has any thoughts before we wrap up.
The only thing I wanted to say is thanks to Jay and Bill again for the content. Jay, I thought that was fantastic, really interesting. We have the topic lined up for next month already, which Michael Skolik from HCL is going to host. I'd like to reach out to anyone on the call that has a topic they want to suggest. We're open for doing what we think is cool and exciting or interesting for you to see, but it would be great to have topic suggestions. So, feel free to reach out on API Academy or directly to me and Bill and suggest those topics. We'd love to get them in the agenda in the upcoming months. And thanks everyone.
Excellent point. And you will be receiving an invite in the next couple of weeks for the next session, which will be the last Wednesday of February. I think that's the 26th, but don't hold me to that. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us today. We do appreciate your time. We are doing this for you. And if you have any, as Aaron said, if you have any technical topics you'd like discussed in Tech Talks, reach out to us. Thank you very much.